Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Mike Nichols. I'm Commercial Director for Cybersecurity Services at Bureau Veritas Europe. Today we are here to talk about ransomware, where we came from and where we are going. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Paul Pols, who is our Ransomware Principal and is going to be talking to you a little bit about how ransomware attacks have evolved in the past and where they will be going. This is not a technical story. Of course, we can get into a lot of technical detail about how ransomware attacks, but today's webinar is really focused on the human story. So, Paul, perhaps you'd like to start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So my name is Paul Pols. I'm a Principal Security Specialist at Secura. I have a background in law, ethics, and cybersecurity. I've been working as an ethical hacker for the last decade or so. And I specialize in everything that has to do with ransomware. So both structuring our services to make sure that we can help our clients become more resilient, but also executing these kinds of assessments ourselves and doing that myself in order trying to hack into companies in using the same tactics and techniques that these ransomware operators are using to give companies an assessment of how well they are positioned to deal with these kinds of attacks.
So we would like to share a little bit about the agenda today.
Yeah, I can take that on. So we'll give you a little bit of an introduction about Secura and Bureau Veritas, but then we'll dive right into it and discuss how did we get here. It's kind of a background story to help understand how things evolved so quickly into this big nuisance that ransomware poses today. And then I want to look into where we're going by discussing some of the incentives and deterrents, the structures that are basically driving this force of ransomware. And then after that, there will be a room for questions. So you can post the questions in the question box in the chat here. And then we'll try to deal with some of these questions depending on how much time we'll have at the end. If there is not enough time to answer all of your questions, we can answer those questions afterwards through email. So don't worry, you'll get your answer.
So it's a really exciting topic. It's a very relevant topic for everybody here. But before we do that, we just like to explain why it is that Secura and Bureau Veritas are here talking today about ransomware. So Secura is a long-standing company working in the cybersecurity space. They've been in business for almost 20 years working in cybersecurity, and they joined the Bureau Veritas group of companies in January 2021. They provide insight into digital security, so helping customers understand where are you on your cybersecurity journey and where you want to get to. And obviously a big part of that is the latest threat of ransomware. Secura works in a broad range of domains with a very broad range of customers in a variety of sectors. That could be the public space, it could be finance, technology companies, industrial companies, and of course, product manufacturers. So covering the full spectrum of IT, OT, and IoT. Just before we jump into the webinar, Paul already mentioned that there will be the Q&A. You don't need to wait until the end of the webinar to post your questions. You can drop them directly into the chat during the webinar. And if they are administrative ones, we'll answer them on the spot. And if they're more technical ones, we'll answer them at the end of the webinar. Paul, thank you, and over to you.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I want to discuss how we got here to help understand basically the history of the cybercrime ecosystem and how it evolved into this ransomware business model. And I want to tell you this story based on the lives of two people that actually shaped this space and that were a driving force behind what ransomware looks like today. And the first person that we'll be discussing is known as Slavik. He is currently wanted by the FBI. They have a $3 million bounty for information leading to his arrest and or conviction. He is the author of the Zeus banking malware, and he was also part of the Game Over Zeus group. And I will explain a little bit later about why he played such a relevant role in creating this business model. The other person whose life is entwined with this story is known as Aqua. He is also wanted by the FBI. They have a $5 million bounty for information leading to his arrest or conviction. He was also part of the Game Over Zeus group, but he moved on to Evil Corp, which you may know as one of the prevalent ransomware groups of the last couple of years. And he is thought to be the perpetrator of financial losses and fraud that ranges in the tens of millions of dollars. So as I mentioned, I want to explain how this ransomware ecosystem basically evolved. And to understand how it was able to evolve so quickly, we have to go back in time and understand what the cybercrime ecosystem looked like before that. So basically how we moved from the banking malware era to the ransomware era. Because as you may remember, back in 2005, over a decade ago, the thing that people had to worry about was malware that was trying to modify your banking transactions. This is basically how people tried to monetize access to systems back then. So looking back at 2005, this is the year that Slavik, the one from the first picture, he created the Zeus banking malware. And Zeus, it was a banking malware Trojan that could be sold as a kit malware. So that basically meant other people could use this malware and perpetrate attacks. So he wasn't perpetrating these attacks himself necessarily. He was making money by selling other people access to his malware that they could use in their attacks on people's systems. And then by modifying data on those systems, they could modify transactions and basically perform bank fraud. And Zeus had this very innovative new element in it. It was called web injects. And that was basically a format in which you could include modifications to websites of all different kinds of banks and other commercial parties that were somehow involved in transactions. And this is what it looked like. For instance, if you were trying to just do your banking business on the Bank of America website or the Citi website, or whatever your bank of choice is, if you had this malware installed on your system and someone had a web inject for that website configured in that malware, then basically it would inject into the website that you would normally show to ask you for additional information. So it would be very normal that they would ask for maybe your ID and a password, but all of a sudden it would also ask for your card number and your PIN number, and maybe then try to get all this information from you and then post it to them so that they could use it for their banking fraud. So this is basically how they try to monetize access to systems back in the day. And this was mostly targeted at the systems of individual consumers. But as you can imagine, basically they were not just targeting consumers, but in a way also targeting banks, because after this was successful, a wire transfer happened, and that meant that the banks were also involved in trying to combat this behavior on their website using their banking systems. So that became harder and harder. For instance, in those years, it evolved into where you could not just log in with a username and a password, but for pretty much all banks, it started requiring multi-factor authentication. So either a challenge response or a one-time password, but basically something, an extra factor on top of your normal login. And that meant the criminals had to keep up. So some of them joined forces. Slavik and Aqua got together with some other people in a group that called itself the Business Club, and they started using a private variant of the Zeus malware called Jabber Zeus. And the thing that was new in there was that it was able to communicate this two-factor codes really quick using a protocol called Jabber, which is a chat protocol, which basically meant as they were doing these modifications, they could send the two-factor authentication codes to themselves and then use them in real time to modify these transactions. And as you can see, they sort of had to step up their game in order to stay ahead of what the banks were doing in order to reduce the amount of fraud that was occurring. Well, this just was a cat and mouse game. It kept going. In the years after that, the Zeus code was leaked. Basically, everybody could start using it. And the Business Club started using an even more innovative variant of the Zeus malware called Game Over Zeus or peer-to-peer Zeus, which was also more resistant against notice and takedown procedures, where it had a peer-to-peer communication option to stay in contact with all of the infected systems. but also they started to target different kinds of people. So back in 2005, this was mainly aimed at consumers doing their normal banking transactions, but they started moving towards attacking companies because attacks were becoming harder. So if you can perform less attacks, maybe try to get more money out of those attacks by attacking bigger accounts, wiring larger amounts of money in order to keep up your revenue, basically. And if you look at how this group, what this group was like and how it operated, it's interesting to see and striking to see basically the similarity with how the ecosystem still looks today. So this Game Over Zeus group, it had two leaders, Aqua and Slavik. Slavik was responsible for all of the technical operations, and Aqua, he was responsible for the people, human resources, and finances. And together they were basically the heads of this operation, this financial criminal enterprise, which had different departments. So you had a support department, which was creating the malware. You had a mule network, which was handling the financial transactions. So basically the fall guys that were actually getting money out at the end of the whole money trail. You had suppliers who were supplying you with all sorts of extra services, and you had affiliates who were performing these attacks with the malware that was created. And this whole structure of how these organization operates is still the way that ransomware operators and ransomware groups are working together. So you have people that are creating the malware, and you have other people, affiliates, who are using that malware to attack companies. And that's also what allows these groups to scale. So you may know these names such as Conti and Black Cat. These are the creators of the ransomware, and they have lots of affiliates who are working with ransomware and that are targeting organizations. And they have suppliers who are performing extra services for them so that they don't have to do everything in-house by themselves. The thing that just became less of a bottleneck for them is the mule network, because back when they were performing bank fraud, the banks were tracing these transactions and tried to stop them. Nowadays, because all of the ransomware money is paid in crypto, it's easier to just leave that money there for a while, and then cashing out is not such an acute problem anymore. So basically, that's the only main thing that really changed in this whole composition. Now, the next big thing that happened in 2013, and this is why I say the story of these gentlemen is so entwined with the ransomware story, because Slavik, he did not only create Zeus and injects, he was also the one that created CryptoLocker. And this was basically the first innovation that started this whole ransomware ecosystem. And you see an example of CryptoLocker here. It was basically spread to the botnets that they already had for their financial and bank fraud. It encrypted those systems of individual consumers, and it demanded 2 Bitcoin to give them access to their systems again. Sounds like a lot of money. I get at nowadays value, that's about $30,000 US. But back then, this was like $300 to get back access to your system, to your photos, to your documents, whatever it may be on your computer. But this was obviously an interesting new option for them because you were no longer battling the banks in what you were trying to do and how you were monetizing your access. You were just monetizing the access directly and getting paid in Bitcoin. Now, in 2014, 2 things happened. First of all, Operation Tovar. It was an FBI operation that basically took out Game Over Zeus, the whole peer-to-peer infrastructure. It was very effective in taking it out. And also some copycats of CryptoLocker started to evolve. So other groups started basically playing around with this new way to monetize access. And after Operation Tovar, Slavik basically called it quits. He retired, but Aqua actually kept doing business as usual, basically started using a different kind of malware. So he moved on from Zeus to Drydex. And with some people from the business club, he started this new operation called Evil Corp, which you may know as a ransomware group. But back in 2015, they were still using their old methods, basically their decade-old methods of trying to monetize access through banking fraud. Then another big thing which really changed how this whole thing works is that SamSam, another group, started doing lateral movement in 2016. So lateral movement is basically what the activity that you perform from going from one infected system to basically targeting the whole network of an organization. It's escalating your privileges and moving laterally with those privileges to more systems. So basically going from one system that can be targeted to targeting a whole corporate network. And obviously, the more systems you have under control, the more money you can basically make. So this was a huge innovation in this sphere. And you see after that, basically all the groups started moving towards that. So in 2017, Evil Corp started using BitPaymer and basically monetizing their access to systems through ransomware instead of through banking fraud. And in the years after that, all the groups moved towards this. I think the biggest shift happened in 2019 of all the groups basically changing their operation to start monetizing access to ransomware. Some small innovation happened after that. So for instance, double extortion, so stealing your data in addition to just encrypting data and threatening to publish that data. But the biggest innovations happened in the years before. So this is basically how this whole ecosystem moved from a banking malware focus to a ransomware focus. Now, what do these attacks actually look like nowadays? This is how you can explain them on a high level. Basically, they try to get into your systems, then move through your network and then take it out. So stealing data, destroying your backups, and then putting ransomware on all of the systems that they have access to. And getting in, it can happen through all sorts of things. Usually these are untargeted methods where they just send out millions of phishing emails, or they scan the entire internet for this one vulnerability that they have, and they infect everything that they can get access to. And after that, they start to look at where did I actually compromise a system? What organization is this? What sector are they in? How much revenue do they actually have? Because the ransomware demand is ultimately tied to the revenue of an organization typically. Now, after they know where they have access to, then they can start to try to get access to more systems. So this is the middle circle, and basically this innovation that occurred because of SAM in 2016. This is hacking through the networks of affected organizations to get more privileges and access to more systems. So this is basically a circle that you keep going through in order to gain the highest privileges to all of the systems in an organization's network. Because if then you steal data from them, and if you can encrypt them, you have the highest impact that you can basically attain. So this is what the attacks actually look like nowadays. And the interesting thing to see here is that this applies to both ransomware attacks and state actor attacks. Basically all advanced attacks nowadays look like this. So this is also what you're up against if you're trying to defend against it. Now, the next question that I want to answer is, where are we going? And obviously I can make some technical predictions, but I want to talk more about the structures that are driving this business model. So what do incentives look like? What are the deterrents? And what does that mean for where this is probably going? Are we at the peak, or is this just going to become bigger and bigger? And first of all, I want to talk about the incentives. There was an interesting study done by Coveware at the end of last year, where they compared the ransomware business model to cocaine trafficking in 1992, so the high days of the Colombian drug cartels. And as you can see here, the revenue per unit, so per attack or per kilo, is actually higher for ransomware. And the operating costs are lower, which means that the profit margins are higher. And very few people are actually getting arrested because of ransomware. And nobody is dying because of ransomware, at least not on the operator side. And the barriers to entry are very low. And if you compare that to cocaine trafficking, it's probably very, very difficult to get a startup there successfully competing with these Colombian drug cartels. If you want to get into ransomware, you probably have to watch YouTube videos in order to understand how to perform these attacks. And especially if you're Russian speaking, it's actually pretty easy to get into performing these attacks, because lots of services that you may need are also offered as services, which you can just buy from someone else. So starting up in this sphere is actually way too easy. So these are some of the incentives that explain why these attacks are so prevalent today and how lucrative they are, basically. And to show you a little bit how that applies to the gentleman that we were talking about, this is Slavik. He was never apprehended. He basically retired after Operation Tofar, so he got rich in the banking malware days. He is reportedly living in a beach town in Russia called Anapa. He has a boat. He loves driving it around the Black Sea. He has property in Russia and outside of Russia. He's pretty well off, and this is what banking malware rich looks like. Now, this is Aqua. As I mentioned, Aqua, he moved on to the ransomware business model after Operation Tofar. So this is Aqua at his wedding. Reportedly, it cost more than $500,000 US. No expenses were spared to make this a great day. Even though these images have sort of become public, he's still free to roam in Russia to this day. This is kind of an iconic image for me to really show what this is like in Russia. So here he is, Aqua, standing next to his personalized Lamborghini. It's one of his cars. He also has a Nissan GTR, an Audi R8, a Dodge Challenger. They're posting videos to YouTube where they're doing street races with these cars. Everybody knows how they got rich, but here he is standing in the middle of the street talking to the police officer without a worry in the world. He has a personalized license plate that spells thief. I think this really basically says it all in terms of the incentives and deterrents of performing these kinds of attacks from Russia. But to dive into these deterrents a little bit more, why are there really no noteworthy deterrents? Like, what is happening here? Well, the first thing to understand is that there's sort of this golden rule in the ransomware ecosystems. If you are part of this ecosystem, terms and conditions apply, but there's this one golden rule: you cannot attack post-Soviet systems. So here you see an example of that, a new affiliate program. So someone has created a new ransomware, basically malware, and they're looking for affiliates who will use that malware to attack organizations. And basically, most important rule is here posted here up front. You can't attack any Russian enterprises with this, because as long as you don't attack Russian organizations, you're not perpetrating any crimes in Russia, and they won't let anyone who performed crimes in another country be extradited. So as long as you're not targeting these Russian systems, there's basically no consequences to what you do. And you see this rule in one of these advertisements, basically, but it's even incorporated into some of the ransomware. Here you see an example from the Suter ransomware, where if they detect that you're trying to execute this ransomware in any of the countries that you see explicitly mentioned here, then it will basically exit with a warning saying that if you try to do this again, you will be banned from our affiliate program, because this is what would really impose risk on them if they are executing this malware in Russia or in Russia's influence sphere, countries that they don't want to get into trouble with geopolitically. So it's really the golden rule that you see throughout all these operations. Now, this is sort of the passive protection that these gentlemen have in Russia, but actually it goes a little bit beyond that in some cases. And I will give you two examples based on the two gentlemen that we are talking about today. So first, Slavik. What was interesting, back in 2013, I was working for a different company and doing some threat intelligence work. And we saw that the Zeus botnet was actually used for national intelligence purposes. So basically, they were looking through these botnet of infected systems for specific national security-related terms. So here you see an example of some of these terms. They had to do with government classified material, things that had to do with the Syrian conflict, the involvement of Russia with mercenaries and arms shipments. Not something you would typically think that a ransomware developer or in that period, a banking malware developer would be interested in. So it's not definite proof that he was working for the intelligence services, but yeah, definitely raises the question why he was performing these sorts of activities, and if maybe there was some relation there. Another example from Aqua, in 2017, he was actually said to be working for the FSB according to the US Treasury Department. And in 2018, again, according to the US Treasury Department, he was actually trying to obtain a license to work with government classified information at the FSB. And back then, he was already on the most wanted list by the FBI. So a simple Google query would show that he was being sought for hacking activities in the West. But even at that period, he could perform activities for the FSB and seek to get a security clearance, basically. So again, yeah, it shows how there can be some of these connections between the top of the cybercrime ecosystem and the intelligence domain, which could also afford them a level of protection beyond just not being extradited to other countries for the crimes that you've committed there. So basically, if you look at it like that, the deterrents were minimal. And given how lucrative the business model is and the lack of deterrent really explains like why there's such a driving force behind this whole ransomware ecosystem. But back in June and afterwards of last year, it did look like maybe something was changing because there were a couple of attacks in the United States, so Colonial Pipelines, JBS, CNA, really big hacks that were targeting large organizations in the US that were starting to affect basically the operations of the society as a whole. So Colonial Pipeline system hack, it actually meant people couldn't get gas at the pumps. JBS, it meant meat couldn't be stocked in supermarkets. These kinds of attacks were really starting to affect day-to-day life in the US. And that was a signal to the US authorities to basically give it a higher priority. So they said, we will give it a similar priority as terrorism, which also meant involving the security and intelligence services in trying to combat these hacks and these groups. So that is changing the deterrence a little bit, because if you know all of a sudden, maybe you won't be extradited, but maybe some of these security and intelligence services of a country such as the US are all of a sudden looking for you and trying to target you, well, that changes the risk-reward balance, right? And also, there was a lot of pressure politically from the US on Russia to do something about these attacks. So here you see an image from Biden and Putin, who had a meeting in Geneva in June of last year, which dealt with this whole ransomware problem, where Biden was really stern with Putin reportedly, and basically putting pressure on him to do something about these ransomware operations. Now, it didn't seem to be very effective at the beginning. So even after that June conference and all the telephone calls that occurred between these leaders, the Kaseya attack happened, which was probably one of the biggest ransomware attacks so far, in which a piece of software was infected, which had effects on MSSPs, so managed security providers, managed software providers, which also affected their clients, and basically, one of the biggest attacks so far. So after that, as I said, the security services really stepped in. They targeted the group that was behind these attacks, known as Ransomware Evil or R-Evil, and they basically stole the encryption keys that were used in that attacks. They pushed REvil offline to really as really a show of force of what they could do against these ransomware operations. And at that point, some of these groups consisted of people operating from Russia and from countries in surrounding Russia, such as the Ukraine. But in some of those countries, it's actually easier to apprehend the people responsible for this. And this was also an example of where that happened. So the R-Evil affiliate who was responsible for the Kaseya attack was actually apprehended and extradited to the US because of their involvement in this Kaseya attack. So again, showing that these attacks are not without consequence. So for people outside of Russia, that was again changing the risk-reward balance of performing these kinds of attacks, which is something that could dampen the effect and the growth of ransomware as an ecosystem. Now, in January of this year, actually the most interesting thing happened in trying to change this risk-reward balance, and that was that Russia was actually stepping in to target some of these groups in Russia. So here you see an example of an image that was released by the FSB to BBC, where they apprehended someone who was an affiliate of the R-Evil group operating from Russia. They took him down. They apprehended lots of money that was made by performing these attacks, and it was really looking like things could change if Russia was stepping in and also doing something about these actors that were operating from its soil. Then maybe things could change and the effects of ransomware could be dampened. Unfortunately, we all know what happened in February of this year. Russia invaded Ukraine, a terrible war, terrible suffering going on there. It really changed the dynamic between Russia and the West, and just a very small part of that whole situation is how it affects cybercrime and the ransomware ecosystem, which is what we're talking about today. But as you can imagine, the way that the relations between the West and Russia have evolved since then also impacts how we can deal with each other on a topic such as cybercrime and ransomware specifically. And in April, an interview surfaced where the Deputy Secretary of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, Oleg Kramov, made this very explicit, where he said that the White House had notified them that they were withdrawing from the negotiation process and closing the communication channel about cybercrime and the apprehension of cybercriminals operating from Russian soil. So basically, that put that to an end. So there is no significant cooperation between these countries anymore on this specific topic. Now, does that mean it's all doom and gloom? Well, not necessarily, because in some of the countries outside of Russia, there may actually be some progress. So here you see an example of that. The example is the raccoon stealer. You see a panel here from that malware. What it basically does after it infects someone's system, it tries to extract all of the password, all of the cookies, maybe access that you have to cryptocurrency, and it will steal that data, and then that can maybe later be used to gain access to systems using your username and password. This malware, it was created by a Russian guy. Sorry, I said Russian. It's actually a Ukrainian guy. He's known as Mark. The authorities were looking into him. This is a photo that was extracted from his iCloud, where you see him with a selfie, probably with basically stacks of money that he made operating this malware, selling it to other people who were again using it in their own attacks. But the whole situation, the geopolitical situation, also meant that people of his age were conscripted after the war basically started. He was not up for that, so he basically fled the country in his Porsche Cayenne with his girlfriend. Here you see a picture where he was crossing the border. Obviously, then the authorities knew that he was outside of Ukraine and somewhere in the West. And actually, the interesting thing here is that his girlfriend was sort of documenting their entire trip on Instagram. So here you see a picture of them on the Dam Square in the Netherlands. And so by tracking their phones and tracking all of their sort of adventures posted on Instagram, they were able to find out where they were staying. And he has since been apprehended, and I think he's awaiting extradition to the US right now. So again, a sign that if you are performing these attacks outside of Russia, then actually something can be done about it. So to all the victims of the raccoon stealer, which is usually a precursor to ransomware, they can actually see if their data was stolen at this website. Let's go back to some of the sort of key takeaways. What should we remember about this talk? Well, basically, what I wanted to convey is that there's a long history of cybercrime as a service. Basically, these are business models that are used to monetize access to systems. And it used to be through banking malware, and that's the thing that changed, is that they're just using ransomware instead. And another interesting thing that changed over the last couple of years is that they moved from targeting the individual systems of people that they infected to targeting entire networks of organizations. So these are the two biggest drivers behind this whole change in monetization. The business model is extremely profitable. The incentives far outweigh the deterrents. So knowing that, it's not a surprise that more and more actors are stepping up and performing these kinds of attacks. And especially for Russian actors, the deterrence is minimalized because of the geopolitical climate since the war in Ukraine. If you want to know more about it, maybe some technical details of how these attacks occur, there's more information on our website. You can go to secura.com/RRA, our ransomware resilience assessment. We have a fact sheet with some more background information if you're interested. That brings me to the Q&A. I'm curious what questions you guys have for us.
So thank you very much, Paul. It was really an enjoyable discussion. And I think you've taken us a little bit back in time and a little bit further into the future. But I think we're seeing a number of questions coming in. One which I think is very interesting is about the technological development of ransomware, because you talked about how the lateral movement kind of revolutionized the way that attacks can take place and allow you to move from one system to multiple. What are you seeing, or what could be the next technological evolution on ransomware software?
Yeah, great question. So what you see nowadays is that on-premises systems are really targeted. So basically Active Directory, Windows domains, this is what allows them to go from one infected system to having a full IT infrastructure under control. But if you look at what our clients are doing, most of them are actually moving away from on-premise and moving system towards the cloud. The ransomware groups are following a little bit, but the greatest majority of their attacks is still targeting on-premise systems. So there is some cloud-native ransomware, but I think that there is definitely room for growth for them there. So as organizations are moving towards the cloud, I think ransomware operations will eventually follow. So I think that's the next frontier of ransomware.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, you talked a lot about, we focused a lot on Russia today and the attacks coming from Russia. And it seems certainly from the history that there was a strong concentration of specific individuals running these groups. How prevalent or how extensive is it now in terms of the number of people operating in ransomware? Is it still very concentrated in 1 or 2 countries, or are we talking about very, very large numbers of groups and individuals working on this?
Yeah, so there are large numbers of groups and individuals working on this, but there are mostly Russian speaking. And that is because some of the deterrents that I mentioned, or the lack thereof, but also because of how they work together. These are typically Russian fora, Russian Telegram groups who are working together, performing these kinds of attacks. They are speaking Russian with each other. So if you're not Russian speaking, it's sort of hard to get into this whole ecosystem in the first place. So that is also sort of a hurdle for anyone who's not Russian speaking to get into these operations. Also explains why it is sort of staying within that geographical area.
Understand. One other question that has come in is around recommendations for defense and control on how to protect your system. So where would you, if somebody was asking you, where should I begin in terms of putting in place my defense against such attacks, where would you start?
Yeah, I would personally, I typically say there are so many ways that someone can get access to your network through phishing or something that you've connected to the internet or a supplier or whatever. That's not the easiest sort of line of defense, but it's what we're used to typically defend the perimeter, basically, firewalls, etc. But the best place to defend is actually within your internal network. Assume breach, just assume that some systems may be compromised at some point. Then can you still defend your internal network? That is the biggest question that I think organizations have to answer. And that is basically a battle that you're having on your home ground. You should know your network better than anyone else, and you're in a good position to defend there. So you can do things in terms of prevention, multi-factor, all the things. For instance, allow listing, what kind of code can be executed on your systems. So you can do all sorts of things on the preventive side, but also looking at detection. If there's something weird happening in your network, you should be able to pick that up and step in before someone goes from having one individual system under control to having basically the whole network under control. And then having a response plan, knowing what you would do if you find something is going on in your network. Don't just start thinking about it if things actually go wrong, because you'll be under pressure and you have difficult decisions to make. Think about that in advance. So prevention, detection, response, there's steps you can take in each one of these areas.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. So we are just up on time. There were some additional questions that have been asked in the box, and we will revert to you offline. Please remember to do not hesitate to follow up with us if there are more questions or comments that you have regarding today's webinar or on ransomware in general. And you can see on the screen here, Paul is sharing his contact details and my contact details. Before we close, you will receive a survey after we close the webinar. And we appreciate very much if you could just take a couple of minutes to complete the survey. Your feedback is really important to us. This is the last webinar of the year for Secura. We hope you've enjoyed it, and please keep a close eye on Bureau Veritas and Secura in the future, because we'll have a great lineup for you in 2023. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great day. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, you're welcome.